No one touches what belongs to Dominic Rossi. When New York's most ruthless crime boss found his quiet, plus-size maid weeping on the cold kitchen floor, he didn't just fire the people who broke her spirit. He burned their entire world to the ground, leaving a trail of blood the Underworld would never forget. The Rossi estate in Oyster Bay, Long Island, was a fortress of limestone, manicured hedges, and dark secrets. It was a place where billionaires and mobsters shook hands over glasses of Macallan 25, deciding the fate of the eastern seaboard's shipping lanes and underground casinos. For 24-year-old Helena Jenkins, however, the estate was just a desperately needed paycheck. Helena was not the typical Rossi employee. The other maids who walked the echoing marble halls of the mansion looked like they had been plucked from a runway, tall, rail-thin, and eager to catch the eye of the wealthy men who frequented the house. Helena, on the other hand, was decidedly plus-size. She was soft-heavy and carried the physical weight of her deep insecurities just as visibly as the curves that she desperately tried to hide under an oversized, shapeless black uniform. She had taken the back-breaking job of a downstairs maid to pay off her mother's crushing oncology bills at Mount Sinai Hospital. Survival left no room for vanity, but her size made her a target. The estate's head housekeeper, Beatrice Gable, was a cruel, sharp-featured woman who ran the domestic staff like a tyrant. Beatrice despised Helena. To Beatrice, Helena's weight was an offense to the aesthetic perfection of the Rossi mansion. The unspoken rules of Mrs. Gable's regime. Total invisibility. Helena was forbidden from cleaning the main floors when Dominic Rossi or his associates were present. She was relegated to the basements, the heavy laundry, and scrubbing the industrial kitchens. The diet mandate. Beatrice frequently confiscated Helena's packed lunches, citing that the Rossi estate doesn't employ gluttons, leaving Helena to work 12-hour shifts on an empty stomach. The blame game. Any broken dish, any missing silver, or any misstep by the younger, prettier maids was instantly blamed on Helena's clumsiness. Helena endured it in silence. She had to, but the hardest part of her job wasn't the agonizing back pain or the hunger, it was the profound, aching loneliness. And then there was Dominic Rossi. At 32, Dominic was the undisputed head of the Rossi syndicate. He was a man carved from marble and violence, with sharp, dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He wore custom Ermenegildo Zegna suits that hid the lethal muscle beneath, and when he walked into a room, the air pressure dropped. Helena was terrified of him. She had only ever seen him from afar, usually from a balcony or peeking through the kitchen doors. To her, he was a dark god of New York, untouchable, lethal, and completely unaware of the fat, miserable maid scrubbing his floors, or so she thought. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Friday in November. Dominic was hosting a massive sit-down for the 5 families, a delicate, high-stakes negotiation with the Philadelphia faction. The mansion was swarming with armed guards, capos, and diamond-draped wives. An hour before the summit, 2 of the hired catering staff called in sick. Panicked Beatrice Gable dragged Helena out of the laundry room. "Put this apron on and don't speak," Beatrice hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Helena's plump arm. "You are to serve the champagne. If you embarrass me, you won't just be fired. I'll make sure you never find work in this state again." Helena's heart hammered against her ribs. Carrying a massive silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of Dom Perignon, she stepped out into the blinding opulence of the main ballroom. The room was a sea of tailored suits, heavy cologne, and dangerous men. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, weaving through the crowd, trying to make herself as small as possible, an impossible task for a woman of her size. That was when she crossed paths with Enzo Bianchi. Enzo was an underboss for the Philly mob, loud, arrogant, and known for his cruel streak. He was holding court near the grand fireplace, smoking a thick cigar. As Helena stepped past him to serve a group of men, Enzo nudged his associate, smirked, and intentionally stuck his foot out. Helena didn't even see it coming. Her foot caught on his polished leather shoe. The physics of her weight and the sudden loss of balance were unforgiving. Helena pitched forward with a gasp. The crash silenced the entire room. Crystal flutes shattered against the imported Italian marble. Hundreds of dollars of vintage champagne soaked into Helena's uniform and pooled around her knees. The sharp shards sliced into her palms as she tried to catch herself, blood blooming instantly against the white floor. For a second, there was dead silence. Then Enzo burst into cruel, booming laughter. "Jesus Christ!" Enzo hollered, clapping his hands. Did anyone feel an earthquake? Or did the Rossi family start hiring whales to do the heavy lifting? A wave of snickering rippled through the ballroom. The other maids stood by the walls, hiding their smiles behind their hands. Helena's face burned with a humiliation so intense it felt like physical fire. Tears instantly welled in her eyes as she frantically began picking up the broken glass with her bleeding, shaking hands. Beatrice materialized from the crowd, her face pale with fury. She didn't help Helena. Instead, she grabbed Helena by the collar of her soaked uniform, practically dragging her to her feet in front of the laughing mobsters. "Get out!" Beatrice spat her voice, ringing clear across the silent room. "You disgusting, clumsy pig, you are fired! Leave your uniform in the basement and get off this property before I have security throw you into the street." Helena couldn't breathe. The medical bills, the eviction notices, the sheer, naked cruelty of the room. She kept her head down, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks, and fled the ballroom as fast as her legs could carry her, leaving bloody handprints on her apron. She didn't see the man standing on the second-floor mezzanine. Dominic Rossi stood frozen, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the mahogany railing. His dark eyes were locked on the spot where Helena had fallen. The basement laundry room was cavernous and damp, smelling of industrial bleach and pressed linen. Helena collapsed into the corner between two massive washing machines, pulling her knees to her chest. She wept with a broken, guttural sound, the kind of crying that comes from the deepest, most exhausted parts of a person's soul. She pulled a rag from a nearby cart and pressed it to her bleeding palms, shivering violently in her champagne-soaked clothes. She was fat, she was ugly, she was a failure, and now she was entirely ruined. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, and Helena sobbed harder, burying her face in her arms. "Let me see your hands." The voice was a low, dark rumble that vibrated against the concrete walls. Helena gasped, her head snapping up. Standing in the doorway of the dim laundry room was Dominic Rossi. He had stripped off his suit jacket. The sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled up to reveal thick forearms wrapped in dark, intricate ink. He looked like a predator stepping into a cage. Helena scrambled backward, pressing her heavy frame against the vibrating washing machine. "Mr. Rossi, I'm sorry, I'm leaving. I swear I just needed to clean the blood off before I—" "Quiet," Dominic said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command that left no room for defiance. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. Helena squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for the mob boss to finish the humiliation Enzo had started. Instead, she felt a sudden, shocking warmth. Dominic knelt on the damp concrete floor directly in front of her, the billionaire boss of the most dangerous syndicate in America, kneeling in the dirt of his own basement. He reached out and gently took her wrists. His hands were massive, calloused from years of violence, yet his touch was impossibly light. He pulled her hands away from her chest and examined the deep, bleeding cuts on her palms. "They made you pick up the glass," Dominic murmured, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. His jaw ticked, the muscle in his cheek feathered. "I tripped," Helena cried, fresh tears spilling over her full cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I know I'm a mess. Mrs. Gable already fired me. You don't have to worry about me being an embarrassment anymore." Dominic's dark eyes snapped up to meet hers. For the first time, Helena truly looked at him. There was a tempest of rage swirling in his irises, but none of it was directed at her. "An embarrassment," Dominic repeated softly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silk pocket square, and began carefully wrapping it around her bleeding right hand. "Helena, do you honestly think I don't know who you are?" Helena froze, her breath hitching. He knew her name. "I know that you arrive at 4:30 a.m. every day." Dominic continued tying the silk tight. "I know you sing softly when you polish the library shelves. I know you take the leftover bread because that miserable hag, Beatrice, steals your food. I know every single thing that happens in my house." He leaned in closer, his thumb grazing the soft, plump curve of her cheek, wiping away a tear. Helena's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. No man had ever touched her with such reverence. No one had ever looked at her body at her size without a shadow of disgust or pity. But Dominic looked at her like she was the only thing breathing in the room. "I let Beatrice run the staff because I had bigger wars to fight," Dominic said, his voice hardening into steel. "But today, a rat touched what is mine, in my own house." "What is yours?" Helena whispered, confused and trembling. Dominic didn't answer with words. He stood up, towering over her, and extended his hand. "Get up, Mia Bella, my beautiful. We have a party to return to." "No," Helena shrank back. "Please, Mr. Rossi, my uniform is ruined. I'm not fit to be up there." "You are going to walk up those stairs with me," Dominic commanded, though his eyes were softening. "And you are going to watch exactly what happens when someone disrespects the future queen of the Rossi family." Helena's mind short-circuited. Queen. Before she could protest, Dominic hauled her gently to her feet. He didn't care about the damp, sticky champagne on her clothes or her heavy weight. He wrapped a strong arm around her waist, pulling her soft curves flush against his hard, muscular side. Upstairs, the gala had resumed its deafening hum of laughter and deal-making. Enzo Bianchi was at the bar, regaling a group of men with an exaggerated retelling of Helena's fall, laughing loudly. Beatrice Gable was directing the remaining maids with sharp snaps of her fingers. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors of the ballroom slammed open. The crack echoed like a gunshot. The music ground to a halt. The laughter died in men's throats. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the entrance. There stood Dominic Rossi, his face a mask of absolute lethal fury. And tucked securely under his arm, visibly shaking, but held upright by his iron grip, was Helena, the fat, bleeding maid they had just laughed out of the room. Dominic raised his free hand and snapped his fingers once. Immediately, the heavy iron locks on the ballroom doors engaged with a loud clack. From the shadows of the room, 24 of Rossi's heavily armed men, led by his ruthless underboss Leo Russo, stepped forward, their hands resting ominously on the Beretta handguns, tucked into their waistbands. The temperature in the room plummeted. The undisputed King of New York had just locked them all inside. "Beatrice." Dominic's voice cut through the dead silence like a serrated blade. The head housekeeper pushed through the crowd, her face draining of color as she saw Helena standing next to the boss. "Mr. Rossi, sir. I threw her out. I don't know how she—" "On your knees," Dominic ordered. Beatrice blinked, bewildered. "Sir, I said get on your knees." Dominic stepped forward, keeping Helena safely behind him. You let a guest assault an innocent woman in my home. You stole from her. You degraded her. You have 3 seconds to get on the floor and start cleaning the remaining shards of glass with your tongue, Beatrice, or Leo is going to drag you down to the meat lockers." The crowd gasped. Beatrice's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing hysterically as she scrambled toward the site of the crash. Dominic's eyes then slowly panned across the terrified crowd, landing dead center on the smug, suddenly pale face of Enzo Bianchi. "Enzo," Dominic purred, taking a step toward the Philly mobster. "I heard you talking about earthquakes." Enzo swallowed hard, taking a step back. "Dom, hey, come on. It was a joke. The Broad was in the way." Before Enzo could finish his sentence, Dominic moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from a nearby table and smashed it directly across Enzo's jaw. The sound of shattering glass and snapping bone echoed through the silent room. Enzo crumpled to the floor, screaming, blood pouring from his mouth. Helena gasped, covering her mouth with her bandaged hands. Dominic stood over the writhing mobster, straightening his cuffs. He looked out at the sea of hardened criminals, politicians, and socialites. "Let me make something perfectly clear to the 5 families tonight," Dominic announced, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. He turned, walked back to Helena, and gently took her bleeding hand, lifting it for everyone to see. "This woman," Dominic declared, his eyes burning as he looked at Helena, "is not a maid. She is not an employee. She is mine. And the next person who looks at her with anything less than absolute worship will leave my house in pieces." The heavy oak doors of Dominic Rossi's private penthouse suite closed, shutting out the chaos of the ballroom below. The air up here was different, scented with rich cedar, expensive leather, and the faint, crisp chill of the November wind rattling the bulletproof glass windows overlooking the Long Island Sound. Helena stood frozen in the center of the massive, opulent bedroom. Her cheap champagne-soaked uniform clung uncomfortably to her heavy frame, and the silk pocket square wrapped around her hand was blooming with fresh red spots. She was trespassing. The downstairs maids weren't even allowed on the 2nd floor, let alone the boss's inner sanctum. Dominic bypassed his mahogany wet bar and immediately picked up the encrypted landline. "Get Dr. Harrison Brooks up here, now, and tell Leo that if Beatrice isn't gone by the time the sun comes up, I'll hold him personally responsible." He slammed the receiver down his broad shoulders, rising and falling, with barely contained adrenaline. He turned to Helena. The lethal, terrifying monster who had just shattered a man's jaw downstairs was gone. In his place was a man looking at her with a hunger so profound it made Helena's knees weak. "Sit," Dominic commanded, gently gesturing to the edge of the sprawling king-sized bed, adorned with fretter silk linens. Helena shook her head, tears threatening to spill again. "I can't. I'll ruin the sheets. Mr. Rossi, please. I don't understand what's happening. I'm just a maid. Look at me." She gestured desperately to her body, her voice breaking. "I'm fat. I'm clumsy. You don't have to pretend to want me just to make a point to those men downstairs." Dominic froze. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocatingly still. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, his large hands gripping her soft, trembling shoulders. "Never say that again." Dominic growled his voice, a low, vibrating rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "Do you think I care about the opinions of the parasites in that ballroom? Do you think a man like me claims something he doesn't want?" He slid his hands down her arms, wrapping around her thick waist, pulling her plush curves flush against his hard, sculpted body. Helena gasped at the contact. "You have spent months hiding in my shadows." Dominic murmured, his dark eyes tracing the full, soft lines of her face. wearing oversized rags, starving yourself because of that miserable hag trying to shrink a body that I have spent every waking moment obsessing over. You are soft. You are warm. You are absolute perfection, Helena. And you are mine. Within 20 minutes, Dr. Brooks, a discreet underground physician who usually patched up gunshot wounds, was carefully stitching the deep gashes on Helena's palms. After he left, Dominic didn't send Helena back to her cramped apartment in Queens. Instead, he made a single phone call. The next morning, the Rossi estate transformed into Helena's personal kingdom. The new directives of the Rossi estate. Medical debt erased. Dominic's private fixers wiped the entire $450,000 balance Helena owed to Mount Sinai Hospital for her mother's oncology treatments. Furthermore, Martha Jenkins was quietly transferred to a VIP private recovery suite at New York Presbyterian. Wardrobe overhaul. Personal shoppers from Saks Fifth Avenue and tailors from Dolce & Gabbana arrived at the estate. They didn't bring loose, shapeless sacks. They brought custom-tailored velvet gowns, fitted silk blouses, and corsets designed to accentuate and worship every single one of Helena's heavy curves. Total authority. The remaining domestic staff were forced to line up in the foyer and personally apologize to Helena. She was no longer their peer. She was their boss. For 3 weeks, Helena lived in a surreal golden haze. Dominic was ruthless on the streets, but worshipped the ground she walked on behind closed doors. He fed her rich, decadent meals prepared by a private chef, kissing the soft skin of her stomach, and thighs systematically dismantling years of cruel insecurities. She was beginning to smile, beginning to realize her own power. But in the underworld, every action has a bloody consequence. The Philadelphia faction was not going to let the assault on Enzo Bianchi slide. Enzo's boss, Carmine the Viper Romano, was an old-school mobster with a long memory and a terrifying reach. Carmine knew he couldn't hit Dominic directly. The Rossi fortress was impenetrable. So he aimed for the newly discovered weak point. He aimed for the fat girl Dominic had foolishly crowned. The threat arrived on a Tuesday. Helena was sitting in the estate's sunroom, wearing a plush cashmere robe, sipping imported tea, when Dominic's right-hand man, Leo Russo, marched in. His face was grim, and his suit jacket was unbuttoned, revealing his shoulder holster. In his hand was a sleek black box, stamped with the logo of Cartier. This was intercepted at the front gates. Leo said, his voice tense. He opened the box. Inside wasn't jewelry. It was a dead, bruised white rose, strangled by a silver wire. Pinned to the stem was a note. Even a fat pig bleeds when you slit its throat. See you at the hospital, Dom. Helena's blood ran cold. The teacup rattled against its saucer. My mother, she whispered, her heart dropping into her stomach. Leo, they know where my mother is. Dominic entered the room seconds later, his face a terrifying mask of controlled, psychopathic rage. He looked at the box, then at Helena's terrified face. Lock down the estate, Dominic barked at Leo. Get 50 men to New York Presbyterian right now. Shoot anyone from Philly on sight. No warnings. Helena stood up, her chest heaving. Dominic, no. If you start a war in a hospital, innocent people will die. My mother will die. Let me go. If I leave, if I disappear, they won't have any leverage over you. You aren't going anywhere. Dominic roared, the sound echoing off the glass walls. He closed the distance, grabbing her face in his large hands. You are my heart, Helena. If they want a war over you, I will drown the entire eastern seaboard in blood. Do you understand me? You stay right here. The retaliation was not just a war. It was an extermination. Dominic Rossi did not negotiate with men who threatened what belonged to him. The night the Black Rose arrived, the New York underworld held its breath as the Rossi syndicate unleashed a perfectly coordinated, brutal symphony of violence against Carmine Romano's empire. The Rossi Retributions Protocol. The ports. At 2 a.m., heavily armed Rossi loyalists seized the Red Hook Marine Terminal, burning Carmine's multi-million-dollar contraband shipments of stolen electronics and narcotics to the ground. The bank accounts Dominic's Wall Street hackers systematically froze and drained Carmine's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, transferring the funds directly to an anonymous trust in Helena's name. The message 6 of Carmine's top capos were found zip-tied to the steering wheels of their luxury cars on the shoulder of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, BQI, stripped of their weapons and dignity. But Dominic saved the mastermind for himself. 3 days after the threat, the war ended, as quickly as it had begun. Helena was pacing the length of the Grand Library, her heart a frantic drum in her chest. She was wearing a stunning, custom-fitted emerald green dress that hugged her wide hips and heavy bust, perfectly a dress Dominic had explicitly asked her to wear. The heavy doors swung open. Dominic strode in, smelling of rain gun oil and dark cologne. There was a dangerous, satisfied glint in his dark eyes. Behind him, 2 massive guards dragged a battered, bleeding man into the center of the Persian rug. It was Carmine Romano. The once feared Philadelphia boss was missing his bespoke suit jacket. His face heavily bruised, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Helena gasped, taking a step back. "Bring him to his knees," Dominic ordered. The guards kicked the back of Carmine's legs, forcing the mobster to kneel directly in front of Helena's plush green velvet heels. Dominic walked over and stood right behind Helena, wrapping his strong arms around her thick waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He wanted Carmine to look up and see exactly who he had threatened and who he was bowing to. "You sent a rose to my house, Carmine," Dominic said, his voice eerily calm. "You threatened the woman who sleeps in my bed. You called her a pig." Carmine spat blood onto the rug, looking up at Helena with a mixture of hatred and sheer terror. "She's a nobody, Dom. You tore up a 30-year peace treaty over a fat maid. The Commission is going to have your head for this." The Commission. Dominic chuckled darkly, kissing the soft skin of Helena's neck. "Just voted unanimously to absorb your territory into mine. They didn't care for your sloppy hospital threats. You're finished, Carmine. But I didn't bring you here to talk business." Dominic stepped around Helena, pulling a heavy silver-plated Smith & Wesson from his waistband. He didn't point it at Carmine. Instead, he flipped it around and offered the grip to Helena. "Take it," Dominic urged softly. Helena stared at the heavy weapon, her hands shaking. "Dominic, I can't. I'm not a killer. I know you aren't Mea Bella." Dominic whispered, his eyes filled with dark, twisted devotion. "You are the light of this empire. I will do the killing for you. But I want him to hear his sentence from the lips of the Queen. I want his last memory on this earth to be the voice of the woman he thought was a nobody." A new, strange fire ignited in Helena's chest. The insecure, weeping maid who had scrubbed the basement floors was dead. Helena didn't take the gun. Instead, she stood tall, her heavy, magnificent curves exuding absolute authority. She looked Carmine dead in the eye, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "You should have left my mother alone," Helena said, the weight of her words pressing down on the room. She turned her gaze to Dominic. "Get this trash off my floor. He's bleeding on the vintage rugs." A slow, wicked smile spread across Dominic's face. It was the proudest he had ever looked. He snapped his fingers. The guards dragged a screaming, thrashing Carmine out of the library, the heavy oak doors sealing his fate. When they were alone, Dominic dropped the gun onto a side table and pulled Helena into his arms. He crushed his lips to hers, kissing her with a desperate, all-consuming passion. Helena melted against him, her thick arms wrapping around his muscular neck, returning the kiss with a fiery intensity she didn't know she possessed. "My beautiful, ruthless queen." Dominic breathed against her lips, his hands exploring the soft, heavy curve of her hips. "No one will ever look down on you again. You rule this city now." 6 months later, the Underworld barely remembered the name Beatrice Gable or Enzo Bianchi. But everyone knew Helena Rossi. The annual Winter Gala was held not at the estate, but rented out completely at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. When the doors of the grand ballroom opened, the room fell dead silent. Dominic Rossi walked in, terrifying and immaculate in a black tuxedo. But all eyes were on the woman on his arm. Helena wore a breathtaking custom Oscar de la Renta gown, woven from liquid gold silk. The dress proudly showcased every inch of her plus-size figure, her generous bust, her thick thighs, her soft, commanding silhouette. Diamonds from Harry Winston dripped from her neck and ears, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't shrinking herself to make other people comfortable. She walked with the grace and heavy, beautiful presence of a woman who held the city's most dangerous monster on a leash. As they walked down the grand staircase, the most feared mobsters, politicians, and billionaires in New York didn't laugh. They didn't whisper cruel jokes. They stepped aside, lowered their heads, and respectfully parted the sea for the Mafia Boss and the magnificent, untouchable woman who had stolen his dark heart. Did Helena and Dominic's explosive love story leave you breathless, from a bullied, invisible maid to the untouchable queen of the New York underworld? Helena proved that true power comes from embracing exactly who you are. If you loved watching Dominic burn the city to the ground for his plus-size queen, smash that like button. Right now, share this video with your fellow Mafia romance addicts and hit subscribe so you never miss another thrilling story. See you next time.